"You're too stupid to handle that money." Those were the first words my own son shouted at me the moment I stepped into his house. For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. I stood there in silence, one hand still gripping the front door, staring at the boy I'd spent my entire life protecting. Except he wasn't a boy anymore. He was standing inside a mansion so grand, it looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet. A crystal chandelier sparkled overhead, and expensive artwork covered walls that seemed taller than the little factory where I'd spent most of my life. My hands were trembling. Not from age, from fear. Only an hour earlier, I'd walked into my bank expecting a simple explanation. Instead, every account I believed belonged to me showed a balance that made no sense. Question after question was met with polite smiles and carefully chosen words. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashcroft, we're not authorized to discuss that." Nobody would tell me where my money had gone. Nobody would explain why. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake. Banks made mistakes. Paperwork got mixed up. Surely my own son would help me understand what was happening. I looked at Sterling and quietly said, "Son, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." He didn't answer. Instead, he laughed. Then he grabbed a thick folder from the kitchen island and slammed it onto the polished marble table so hard that the sound echoed through the house. "You're too stupid to handle that money," he yelled. Before I could even speak, Vanessa walked into the room holding a glass of wine. She looked at me, smiled, then laughed. "You're just waiting to die anyway." She took another sip before adding, "Why should $47.8 million sit in an old man's account?" 47.8 million. Hearing those words from her mouth felt colder than winter. I couldn't find the strength to argue. I simply turned around, walked back to my old pickup truck, closed the door, and cried harder than I had in years. Before we continue, subscribe and join our growing family for emotional stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable life lessons. Also, tell me your country in the comments. I love reading where everyone's watching from. 3 weeks later, that same son couldn't even keep his hand steady when the bank called. But before I tell you why, you deserve to know how $47.8 million ever became mine. My name is Alistair Ashcroft. I'm 71 years old, and for almost 4 decades, I owned a manufacturing company called Ashcroft Industrial Systems. We built heavy industrial equipment that ended up in factories, shipyards, and construction sites all across North America. People see the number $47.8 million and assume I was born into privilege. I wasn't. When I was 32, my entire business fit inside a rented garage with a leaking roof and a rusty metal door that barely closed. My biggest machine had been bought at an auction after another company went bankrupt, and half the time I had to kick it just to make it start. The only people who believed in me were 2 loyal workers who accepted late paychecks because they believed my promise that better days would come. There were weeks when the bank account held less than $100. More than once, the bank warned me they would foreclose if I missed another payment. Every time I thought about giving up, Eleanor, my wife, would place a warm cup of coffee beside me, squeeze my hand and say, "You've come too far to quit now." She believed in my dream long before I did. Years later, I discovered she'd quietly sold her mother's jewelry to cover payroll during one of our worst months. She never told me at the time because she knew I would have tried to stop her. That was Eleanor. She never carried my burdens by talking about them. She simply carried them. Every anniversary she'd spread travel brochures across our kitchen table and smile. "One day we'll see Italy, maybe Scotland too." I'd kiss her forehead and reply with the same words every year. One more year. I truly believed I was doing it for us. I just didn't realize how quickly one more year could become an entire lifetime. And when I finally kept that promise, life had already made another decision. The company eventually became everything I dreamed it could be. The little garage turned into 3 manufacturing plants. The 2 men who took a chance on me became department managers. Many of my employees stayed with me for over 30 years. They weren't just workers anymore. They were family. When the day finally came to sell the business, I walked through every department one last time, shaking hands with people who had helped build it from nothing. A few weeks later, the money arrived. $47.8 million. More money than Eleanor and I could ever spend. I remember placing a stack of travel brochures on our dining room table and saying, "No more waiting." She smiled the same beautiful smile I'd fallen in love with 43 years earlier. For the first time in decades, there were no meetings, no deadlines, no factories calling in the middle of the night. We packed our suitcases, booked a 6-month journey across Europe. Then everything changed. A routine doctor's appointment became more tests. More tests became a biopsy. The biopsy became words no husband ever wants to hear. Advanced pancreatic cancer. Within months, the woman who had carried me through every storm was gone. After the funeral, I stopped answering calls. I stopped caring about money. Some mornings I didn't even care whether I got out of bed. That's when Sterling stepped in. My son. He drove me to appointments, answered my phone, met with accountants, handled paperwork, paid bills. For the first time in years, I felt like my son was taking care of me instead of the other way around. Looking back now, I realize grief has a cruel way of making you trust people you never should. Grief changes the way time moves. Some mornings I woke up convinced Eleanor was still asleep upstairs. Other mornings I couldn't even remember what day it was until I looked at the calendar hanging in the kitchen. The doctor adjusted my medication more than once. Some pills helped me sleep. Others left me feeling as though I were walking through a thick fog. Those were the weeks Sterling became my shadow. Dad, don't worry about the paperwork. Dad, I'll drive. Dad, I'll meet the lawyer. Dad, you just need to rest. At the time, those words sounded like love. Looking back, I hear something very different. There were meetings I barely remember attending. Estate meetings, tax meetings, investment meetings. People in expensive suits would slide documents across polished conference tables while Sterling calmly explained everything before anyone else could speak. It's routine, Dad. Just another signature. This protects you. This saves taxes. This keeps everything organized. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. Every signature took only a few seconds. Sometimes I didn't even finish reading the first page before Sterling pointed to another place that needed my name. Yet little things began to feel strange. One afternoon, a banker who had known me for nearly 20 years looked up from a document, opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then quietly looked back down. He never finished his sentence. A week later, my longtime accountant stopped returning my calls altogether. Sterling simply smiled and said, "He's probably busy. I'll take care of it." Meanwhile, Vanessa seemed happier than I'd ever seen her. New designer handbags appeared almost weekly. Construction trucks arrived at their house. The old kitchen disappeared. Luxury furniture was delivered. When I asked how they suddenly decided to renovate, Sterling laughed. Timing finally worked out. I smiled and believed him. I wanted to believe him. Because the alternative was something no father ever wants to imagine. The first person who realized something was wrong wasn't me. It was someone at the bank. The phone rang just after 9 on a Tuesday morning. It was the dealership confirming the delivery date for the sub Eleanor and I had ordered before she became sick. I thanked the salesman and told him I'd stop by later that afternoon to finish the payment. I truly believed everything was normal. An hour later, I walked into my bank. The same bank I'd used for decades. The young teller smiled politely until she typed my account number into her computer. Her smile disappeared. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashcroft. One moment, please." She disappeared into the manager's office. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, the branch manager invited me into his office and quietly closed the door. "I was hoping to transfer some funds," I said. He stared at his screen much longer than necessary. Then he folded his hands. "I'm afraid I can't assist you with that request." I frowned. "I don't understand." He forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, I'm simply not authorized to discuss your accounts." Those words made no sense. Not authorized? It was my money. I asked again. He repeated exactly the same sentence. Nothing more. Nothing less. Confused, I left the bank and immediately called Sterling. He answered on the second ring. "Oh, that's just part of the restructuring, Dad." "Dad? What restructuring?" "The financial restructuring we talked about." "Animize, I guess. Try to hid. I don't remember discussing it." He chuckled. That's because you've had a lot on your mind lately. Relax. Everything's exactly as it should be. His voice sounded so calm, so confident. I wanted to believe him. After all, he was handling everything while I was still trying to learn how to live without Eleanor. A few days later, that same branch manager called me privately. His voice was almost a whisper. "Mr. Ashcroft, I can't tell you what to do." He paused for several seconds. "But if I were in your position," another long silence, "I'd speak to an independent attorney." Before I could ask why, he politely ended the call. I stood there staring at my phone, convinced the whole situation would somehow fix itself. I ignored that advice, and it became the biggest mistake of my life. I tried to convince myself the bank manager had simply been overly cautious. After all, Sterling had handled nearly everything since Eleanor passed away. Maybe I really had forgotten conversations because of the medication. Maybe the paperwork truly was routine. But over the next few weeks, little pieces stopped fitting together. One afternoon, I drove past a dealership and saw my son climbing out of a brand new Italian sports car. I smiled at first, thinking perhaps he'd rented it for the weekend. A week later, I learned he'd bought it. Then came another. Then came another. Then another. Before long, people around town were talking about Sterling Ashcroft more than they had ever talked about me. A waterfront mansion, a 70-foot yacht, private club memberships, luxury vacations that seemed to happen every month. Vanessa documented every moment online. Designer handbags, diamond bracelets, champagne parties overlooking the ocean, photographs beside private jets. Every picture carried the same message. We've made it. What hurt the most wasn't the money. It was that not once did either of them invite me over. Not once did they ask if I was doing all right. Instead, former employees began calling. "Mr. Ashcroft, have you seen Sterling's new house? Did he really buy a yacht? I thought you always taught him to live modestly." Rumors spread faster than truth ever could. Some people whispered that I'd secretly handed everything over to him. Others believed I'd become too old to manage my own affairs. Eventually, I couldn't live with the questions anymore. So I drove to his mansion, hoping my son would simply explain everything. Instead, you already know what happened. He threw a folder onto the table. "You're too stupid to handle that money." Vanessa laughed. "You're just waiting to die anyway." I didn't argue. I quietly walked away because something inside me finally understood the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal. Sitting in my pickup outside their gates, I searched for one name I'd been given years earlier by another business owner. Attorney Vivian Blackwell. She answered on the second ring. That evening, I placed every document I'd signed across her conference table. She read the first page, turned to the second, then stopped. She studied one document for less than 60 seconds, then smiled. I expected Vivian Blackwell to tell me my money was gone forever. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and asked one question. "Mr. Ashcroft, during these meetings, were you still taking medication after your wife's passing?" I nodded. She didn't say another word. Within days, her office became busier than a construction site. Forensic accountants examined every transfer. Medical specialists reviewed my treatment records. Former bank employees were interviewed. Lawyers requested documents I'd never even known existed. Every signature, every meeting, every phone call, every bank instruction was placed under a microscope. Meanwhile, life seemed to get even better for Sterling. Another luxury vacation, another expensive watch, another magazine article praising his business success. It was as if the world had decided he was some brilliant young entrepreneur. Only Vivian never looked impressed. Late one afternoon, she invited me back to her office. Stacks of files covered nearly every inch of her desk. She tapped one folder with her finger. "Your son made one mistake no experienced fraudster ever makes." I stared at her. "What mistake?" She smiled gently. "I'd rather let the banks explain that to him." That answer frustrated me almost as much as it intrigued me. Days later, I learned Sterling had done something I never imagined. Using the wealth he'd taken control of, he had borrowed another $20 million. The loan financed even more luxury, more investments, more toys. More appearances. Everything depended on one assumption, that the fortune would always remain under his control. Vivienne simply closed the file and said, "People who steal often become greedy. Greed makes them careless." I still didn't understand exactly what she meant, but I trusted her. For the first time since Eleanor died, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. If you're enjoying the story so far, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Because what happened over the next 3 weeks changed every life in this story. Exactly 21 days after I walked out of Sterling's mansion, my phone rang just after 8 that morning. It was Vivienne. Her voice was calm. "They've signed the order." I didn't ask what order. Somehow, I already knew. An emergency court order had frozen every asset connected to the disputed transfers until the investigation was complete. The $47.8 million would not move another inch. For the first time in weeks, I simply closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Less than an hour later, another phone started ringing. Only this one wasn't mine. It belonged to Sterling. I didn't witness the conversation, but I later learned exactly what happened from court records and bank testimony. At first, he sounded confident. There has to be some mistake. Then his voice changed. "What do you mean, the accounts are frozen?" Several minutes later, another department called. This time, it was the commercial lending division. The representative explained that the assets securing his $20 million loan were now legally under dispute. Without uncontested collateral, the bank could no longer keep the loan active. Immediate repayment was required. Sterling laughed nervously. "You can't be serious." The answer was simple. "We are completely serious, Mr. Ashcroft." Another call followed. Then another. Private bankers, investment advisors, credit officers. Every conversation sounded worse than the last. By lunchtime, the confidence that had filled his voice only weeks earlier had completely disappeared. Witnesses later said his hands shook so badly, he dropped his phone twice while trying to answer another call. For the first time in his life, money couldn't solve the problem. Charm couldn't solve it. Anger couldn't solve it. The rules he believed only applied to other people had finally reached his front door. As I sat quietly on my porch that evening, I didn't feel joy. I felt something much heavier. The painful certainty that every lesson I'd spent 40 years trying to teach my son had finally found its way back to him. Then I watched something I'd spent 40 years teaching my son finally teach him instead. The bank moved much faster than Sterling ever imagined. Within days, formal notices began arriving. Then came the appraisers. Then the recovery agents. The waterfront mansion he'd proudly shown off online was the first to fall. Luxury cars disappeared one after another, loaded onto transport trucks before curious neighbors who quietly watched from across the street. The yacht he'd called his retirement reward was seized before he had even finished paying for it. Investment accounts were frozen. Private club memberships were canceled. Business deals collapsed overnight. The investors who once competed for dinner invitations suddenly stopped answering his calls. Friends who had toasted his success discovered they were unexpectedly busy. Even the people who had called him a financial genius quietly disappeared. Then came the betrayal he never expected. Vanessa. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply hired one of the city's best divorce attorneys. Over the following week, she removed every piece of jewelry that legally belonged to her, packed designer handbags into expensive suitcases, and walked through the mansion one final time. Sterling stood silently in the hallway. "I thought we'd get through this together," he whispered. She looked at him without the slightest emotion. "I married a man who knew how to build a future." She paused before opening the front door. "I never agreed to drown in your debt." Then she walked away without looking back. Watching all of this from a distance, I finally understood something Eleanor had tried to teach me years earlier. Money doesn't change people. It simply gives them more opportunities to reveal who they've always been. Sterling was left with no mansion, no yacht, no luxury cars, no friends, no wife. Only a mountain of debt created by his own greed and decisions. I never celebrated his downfall. A father doesn't celebrate watching his own child lose everything. But neither could I rescue him from consequences he had built with his own hands. The court still hadn't made its final decision. But my answer had already become clear. Nearly 4 months after I first walked into Sterling's mansion, the court finally reached its decision. The judge ruled that the transfers had been obtained through undue influence while I was grieving the loss of my wife and relying on medication that affected my judgment. One by one, every disputed asset was returned. $47.8 million. The fortune I'd spent nearly 4 decades building finally came home. Sterling, however, wasn't nearly as fortunate. Because the $20 million loan had been taken out in his own name, using assets he had no legal right to pledge, the court left that responsibility exactly where it belonged. With him. The banks continued pursuing every remaining dollar. There would be no rescue. People often ask whether I celebrated. The truth is, I didn't. Winning a lawsuit couldn't bring Eleanor back. No amount of money could buy the years we postponed together. So I decided the fortune would never again exist only to make one family wealthy. Instead, it would become something bigger than me. A few months later, I opened the Eleanor Ashcroft Legacy Foundation. Its first scholarships went to the children of the men and women who had spent decades helping me build Ashcroft Industrial Systems. Former welders, receptionists, truck drivers, machine operators. Many of them stood beside me on opening day with tears in their eyes. We also created emergency medical grants for retired employees and their families. But the project closest to my heart was something Eleanor would have loved. Travel grants for terminally ill couples. If even one husband kept a promise he was about to postpone, then perhaps Eleanor's story would help another family avoid my greatest regret. As everyone applauded that afternoon, I looked toward the empty chair beside me. In my heart, I knew she would have smiled. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. Never postpone the people you love while chasing the life you think you're building for them. Because tomorrow is a promise none of us has ever been given. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what lessons stayed with you the most. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take care of the people you love while you still have the chance.